Tiffany and you. One and one together make two. All the stories that are true. Tiffany and you.
You're listening to Tiffany and You. This is your host, Tiffany Yu. On this episode, I'm joined by Jerron Herman, who is a dancer and cultural critic. Jerron and I met 5 years ago to this month at New York City's inaugural Disability Pride Parade. On July 26, 2020, we recognized the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Diamond Anniversary. It's a huge milestone for our community, and so Jerron and I reflected on how far we've come, how far we have to go within our own disability narratives and stories, and how he is using dance and art and storytelling to continue to advocate. I hope you all are enjoying this episode and the end of what a couple of cities have designated as Disability Pride Month. Hi, everyone. It's Tiffany Yu here, and you're listening to this episode of Tiffany and You. Today, I have with me Jerron Herman. Hi, Jerron.
Hi, Tiffany.
So, Jerron Herman is an interdisciplinary artist creating through dance, text, and visual storytelling. He's based in New York City. So, Jerron and I met 5 years ago to this month at the inaugural Disability Pride Parade in New York City. We were watching the main stage and we were standing next to each other, and you turned to me and you said, "Cool bag," because I had
I did say
I had a
cool
black
bag.
yes, I had a black tote bag with a white Diversibility logo. Did I give you a bag?
I don't think so. But you got me plenty of work, so and different resources. So I'll call it a draw.
We'll call it a draw. But I remember that because we connected because we both had arms that looked different. And so
Right.
I wanted to start there because disability origin stories are really important. And I have actually come to learn more recently from an earlier guest named Victor Pineda that some of us actually have two origin stories. The one is whatever our disability is. And then the second is when we actually took ownership of our disability identity. So I'd love to hear your origin story, however that manifests itself.
Cool. Okay, so origin story 1. I was diagnosed with hemiplegia cerebral palsy when I was 3 months old, and my whole personality and all of my interests and sort of outlook paradigm was shaped by that diagnosis, because it became my mission to counter everything that was prognosticated, really. It was a way in which I needed to include nuance into the diagnostic definitions of how my body would function, how I would function, and what I could contribute to my environments. And that led me to the arts, where I felt quite unfettered. It was the place that you weren't predicated on your physical prowess or your physical characteristics to engage in. And my creativity was piqued by storytelling and by this mental and this ephemeral game of creating and organizing worlds and other contexts that people could be free. And so that led me deep into the arts. I mean, I'm a true theater geek, full on, and was really obsessed with Broadway and musicals and drama.
You're in the right city for it.
Exactly. I mean, honestly, it was the main reason why I came to New York. I just knew that I could be productive here. And my advocacy for disability was, of course, ingrained, although I did have a very different approach to it. I was going to be a maverick, and I wasn't going to associate myself with the typical disability community. I was just going to assimilate into mainstream culture and do it that way, which there are implications and consequences for both. But at the time, I thought that I would have been stymied by being a part of a community rather than bolstered, especially because there was still, in my view, no nuance in what the community looked like. And so, although my parents were always encouraging me to meet disabled people and meet disabled activists, especially in the Bay Area, where unbeknownst to me was the birthplace and the Fertile Crescent of disability theory. So it was a perfect place to have gotten an early education. A little kind of scary happenstance, one of those moments when you're like, what if I had just turned the corner? I did a dance class when I was like 11 at the Alice Center in Oakland, where Axis Dance Company it's headquartered. So, now that I am a professional dancer, I just thinking to that moment, I'm like, oh my gosh, what if I had just something else had happened that day at that random dance class at the Alice Center for me to have met Axis Dance, and then what would have been my paradigm after that. So that's a really funny moment. But then when I came to New York, I was about this myopic understanding of art and of being a disabled person in art, but by serendipity, I met a choreographer during one of my internships that led me to Heidi Latsky Dance, where I joined the company for 8 years. And it was in the company that I was inundated with different visions of disabled people and became more comfortable with the idea of connecting myself to the legacies and the contemporary outlook of disabled people, especially in the arts. And my comfort level grew to authentic friendships and connections, which I think are at the crux of my advocacy now, in terms of the welcoming that is supposed to transcend accessibility in our thinking, and the kind of welcoming, the kind of access culture that we want to engender, access intimacy, as penned by Mia Mingus. These things are cultivated when you actually know your community and know who you're with. And so, in a microcosm of the dance company, I begat and kind of forwarded those ideals by understanding who I was with. And that led me to really understand disability for myself. And actually, the 2015 Disability Pride Parade was overwhelming for me, because it was the first time I think that I really did own it. I mean, I was owning it on stage for the last 2 years before that, but there was something hurly-burly about it from that point on, that I was comfortable with the political ideation of disabled. I was comfortable with the legacies that bred that thought. And I was comfortable with pushing, again, the nuance of what it would mean to be a disabled artist.
Beautiful. Thanks so much for sharing that journey. I reached out to you because I showed up at the Disability Pride Parade in 2015 by myself. Diversibility party of one.
But mighty one.
A mighty but petite one. Kind of just reflecting on what the past 5 years have looked like. I'm hearing this theme around growing up and trying to decide whether you wanted to associate or disassociate from the disability community. Did you think that going to an Access Dance Company when you were 11, dance class, was that a turning point for you in terms of seeing the different types of bodies that could be dancers?
Right. Well, that was the thing. It wasn't an Access Dance Company class. It was just a random Saturday movement class that had no distinction or no focus lens on disability movement, or it wasn't even manifested by Access, because they just happened to be in the same building. It was this like big community center building that a lot of different businesses were in, but having known Access for the years I have, that's where they were headquartered. So I just remember, like, what if I had actually seen wheelchair dancers as I passed another studio or something? And I think too, when I'm in the studio, maybe at Gibney Dance Center or the new 42nd Street Studios, and people are passing me, and what do they think? I think that it would have been just as absorbing and as changing as anything that I have ever been exposed to, that kind of sits in my mind and my brain. The one thing that is different is the opportunities after the exposure. And I think that's the thing that always is hard, because you can be exposed. I was exposed to so much as a child, and I have a breadth of experiences because of my family's kind of atypical offerings. But then the opportunities I had to write or to act or to dance, they were special, and they had to come through some means of creativity.
Mm. So you were with Heidi Lasky Dance for 8 years. I remember going to many of your performances, the most notable of which was called On Display.
Mm.
And I'm curious what dance represents to you and what dance and disability means to you.
Yeah. So I walked into dance as a baby learner. I mean, I was 20 on top of never really knowing dance vocabulary. And I was not the sole disabled member, but throughout the maybe 5 years and then the transition with On Display happened, I was a consistent disabled member. There was be a flux of other disabled artists that would come through, but I kind of stayed in the main cast for the longest. That led me to actually assimilate to dance vocabulary and culture and history sooner and primarily. I was more interested in the aesthetic, trying to grasp that in my own body. I was very interested in its legacies, like how Heidi Latsky, even the man who introduced me to Heidi, Sean Curran, she and him were in a modern dance company called Bill T. Jones Arnie Zane Dance Company, which was very radical at its time and is still. I mean, Bill T is a very towering figure. And then he himself, Bill T, comes from like a Judson era legacy of Yvonne Rainer and Steve Paxton and Simone Forti. And so there's this tracking when it gets to me and my identity, wherein I think that there have been embodiments and vocabularies and practices that actually make sense that disabled people should be in dance, especially with our postmodern sensibilities, our attention to different bodies, our acceptance of minutia as movement, and then also, I guess, what you call the expansion of community work and community involvement, so that the practice of dance doesn't have to look as elitist as it has been, and that the process of making work can be way more inclusive. Of course, my experience has been that disabled-led creators and disabled-led companies tend to push that inclusion beyond what is often comfortable for the venues that want to produce them. And so that's been the next phase I've been seeing, wherein, and not to diminish anything that physically integrated dance companies have done, but when it's not in your bones, it's not in your bones. It's the conniption of access in spaces, how to devise that, how to devise ASL interpreters and captioners and audio describers, how to include possibly tactile information for low vision and blind folks, and a whole host of other accoutrements that would actually make disabled people welcome in your disabled-led creativity. On Display was
Provocative.
oh my gosh, it was provocative. It served a really awesome moment.
I've been thinking a lot recently about discomfort. There is something around a disabled body that I think causes people who don't wear those identities to feel uncomfortable. And I've been having a lot of conversations recently around how now that we've moved to a virtual first platform, there has been a little bit of an equalizer where I can show up passing as non-disabled and am the same size square or rectangle as everyone else. And interestingly enough, my response to that is that I actually do want you to see my splint. I want you to see my arm, and I want you to feel what it's like to feel uncomfortable, because that's how we have felt our whole lives.
Right.
Right. And I think that to me is what was so provocative about On Display, because there's a quote I really like from Harry Winston that says, "People will stare, make it worth their while."
That's the spirit of On Display for sure.
I want to take a break here. And then when we come back, I want to talk about what post Heidi Latsky dance life looks like for you, because I know you've got a whole suite of really incredible projects that you've been working on. I've been using Anchor to record these podcast episodes. I wanted to include a little bit about why. First of all, it's totally free, and they have all these creation tools that have allowed me to record and edit this podcast right from my phone and computer. Anchor's even helped me distribute my podcast, so now you can hear this episode across Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, pretty much wherever you get your podcasts. If you've always wanted to start a podcast, download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Even though this is a presidential election, there are many more candidates on the ballot besides the president. Go to Ballot Ready for a nonpartisan guide to your entire ballot. From there, you can compare candidates based on stances on issues, biography, or endorsements, and then save your choices to use when you vote by mail or in the voting booth. You can even request your absentee ballot or make a plan to vote early or on election day. This election matters. Make sure you have a plan to vote and vote informed. This year, with changes to polling places and vote by mail laws as a result of COVID, it's more important than ever to have a plan to vote. 30% of voters take the time to vote and then leave some part of their ballot blank. This is a missed opportunity to choose the leaders of our communities. And it's okay if you're unfamiliar with some of the more local positions. We recommend hosting a ballot party, get together with friends over Zoom, split up the research, and go through your ballots together. Go to ballotready.org and enter your address to make a plan to vote and vote informed. And we're back from the break here. This is Tiffany Yu on the Tiffany and You podcast in conversation with Jerron Herman, who is an interdisciplinary artist. Before the break, we were chatting about the 8 incredible years that he had with Heidi Latsky Dance. I wanted to ask you, the New York Times called you, quote, the inexhaustible Mr. Herman, end quote.
Yeah.
What's the story behind that?
So that was from a show called Critic, which was a big feat of our energy. I mean, when I started in Heidi's company, that was the second piece that we had started. I had done a revival of GIMP right before, and then we began this long 3.5-year process of developing Triptych. So by the time we got to the premiere, I think we were all fired up and ready to perform. And it's special, I think, because I value being inexhaustible. I value being seen as raring to go and uninhibited. And that piece was the first time I was able to showcase a variety of functions and of abilities that I had accrued over the years that I had been developing with the company. What is referred to in that quote is my duet with Greg Uden, wherein he and I are the same person, essentially. I love your analogy about the boxes and being the same, because that was what we were playing with. We were playing with this idea of, can you notice or not notice the differences between us if our arms are codified? And that was really successful in kind of and starting a narrative on, well, what are the implications of erasure? If you erase what is distinct, and why does it matter? Or even what does it do in sanitizing both of those people within the exchange? It's like Greg had to subdue himself in order to meet me, and then at a certain point I had to let him go and just do what I do. And I think as well, like, my performance philosophy is just to be as abandoned as possible. And so I think that's what endeared me to Heidi, who's just equally as abandoned in her performing.
And what does that mean, as abandoned as possible?
Yeah. In dance, I feel the extension of my body. I feel in the leaps or the plies or twists or the turns that I use, even the rigidity of, say, my left leg, or the hypermobility of my right side to, as they say, eat up the space. I mean, I think a Marley dance floor is your opportunity to transcend the physical environment. It's your moment, though it's constrained. Like, there's nothing better than dancing a full phrase off into the wings, for example. It's this necessary need to fly. And I've been always interested in just exerting all that I am in a moment. I think it's important, and I think it shows your fidelity to the movement and actually respect to the movement if you really do perform it in a way that just you leave nothing left. And so in that way, I do become inexhaustible because in general, I don't want to reserve anything or leave anything in the tank when performing or even in a state of creativity, because why? There's a sense of in my creativity that I've been waiting for so long for moments that I can express myself. So I'm thirsty for it, and that's my response in performing.
Yeah. I love the words that you use. A lot of what you said also resonated with me. I mean, I think, first of all, this is why I love disability origin stories, because everyone has a very different one. And I also think the context of parenting and the environment that you grew up in really matters a lot as well.
Agree.
And a lot of what I've been talking about now is how can I fill my space, which I think is your equivalent to being abandoned.
Yeah.
So in my research for this, I saw that you don't call yourself an activist. And is that still the case today, or has your relationship to that label changed?
Yeah. No, it really hasn't. I even made a piece about it. So last year for 8829, I was graciously invited to perform at the Whitney Museum, and I presented a work called Many Ways to Raise a Fist. And it was supposed to reflect on my burgeoning understanding of protest culture and of its intertwining legacies among other marginalized communities, and especially the disability community. In my practice in general, I love to define and really sink into the definition of words and why we place meaning, or even what meaning is placed on them, and whether or not they are useful anymore. So my critique is really like, is the usefulness of this word as charged or as important as we think it is? And then I go into a piece about that. And protest for me, in conversations with other people I'm in community with, just really has been, or even activism has really narrowed and, again, not included nuance enough for the people that it could be a container for. So we can definitely hold several ideologies at once, but I feel that protest doesn't have to look singularly like marching, and doesn't have to look singularly like posting on social media, but that, again, knowing who you're talking to and knowing your community is a way in which you can advocate for them and push things forward. So the piece was like, what if joy could be a protest, and what if actions that are for rest and are for peace are also protests? So that led me to feel like I still don't really think of myself as an activist. Also, I think that it's often too tied to disability identity as like a priori understanding of disability, that if you are disabled, then you are an activist. And I want to give that a little bit breath too, because just because you're Catholic doesn't mean you're a priest. And it's like idea of like, you have to be the apex, you have to encompass a lot of things at the same time. I want to push against that a little bit. And I think that also other people in the disability community are better suited to be activists than I am. I feel like I'm a storyteller. And now I see this infographic about like the many ways you can serve your community, and storytelling is one of them. And there's also organizer and the nurse and all these other components of being part of a community. So I don't think it's my role still. It's my role.
Yeah, I think that's powerful. So you talk about being a storyteller. There's a quote on your website that says, "From an early age, I wondered, what could I contribute to society, to creativity? Now, an artist, I'm unflinchingly contributing all of me. What part do you want?" Beautiful. Can you talk to me a little bit about what advocacy and what does storytelling look like for you these days?
Yeah, no, that's so keen. The Disabled List, started by Liz Jackson, has been a wonderful resource in terms of just having a database of folks that, if you'd like a perspective on X, here's person Y. Liz has been a great friend and a comrade in all things kind of ideological. And then I still do work with the National Dance Institute and their burgeoning physically integrated dance classes and programs, especially the Dream Project. I just finished curating a series of access culture talks with the Shelley and Donald Rubin Foundation, which was exciting for me. And I was able to bring together some artists, disabled artists and institutions, and talk about what welcoming would look like logistically in a policy way. And then last year, I had the biggest solo performing year I've ever had. And so now I'm just kind of sitting with those pieces. I made 3 different works in like 8 months, and it was the wildest thing I ever did. No one should do that.
Not recommended.
Not recommended at all. But it was lovely. It was lovely, and I think I was just frenzied and ready to try something different. And now I have 3 new pieces that I'm continuing to dissect and disseminate and do different things with. And then I've been working with Kinetic Light, Alice Shepard, Laurel Lawson, and Michael Magg, their new shop of just interrogatory art making. We're developing this new piece called Wired, which details the gendered, racialized, and historicized legacy of barbed wire in America. And it's a lovely piece that I'm super excited to be part of. And then I'm doing a little bit of, I have in me I don't know if you would call it a historical, sociological project, where I want to think about my body as a fulcrum for discussions on geographical phenomenon. So I'm using, again, the power of definition to assert a perspective on our world. Hemiplasia, to me, also connotes hemispheres. And I want to start to think about how hemispheres narrate different things in our culture, and how maybe the movement on my body and on my hemispheres can translate about some truths that we deal with, and just uncover those things. So is that a map project? Is that an essay? Is that a scholarly text? Is that a dance? I'm moving through those things, what the container would look like. But I do know, and a couple of friends have encouraged me, that it's time to really dip into my interdisciplinary practices, how text, how movement, how voice do operate together to create a new container. That's what's on the horizon, Tiffany.
Yeah, not much going on. We're recording this during July. It's the 30th anniversary of the ADA.
Yeah.
I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that we are living in a pandemic, and we are living through what I am calling, inspired by my friend Nicole Cardoza, a civil rights revolution. And so I thought I'd start by checking in on you and hearing how you're feeling around Black Lives Matter and around Black disabled lives matter.
Right. So I was actually troubled by it for a couple of reasons. I think these are the times when, again, I'm all about definition. So I need to know who the voice is. And I'm in favor of Black Lives Matter as a concept, as a thing to name. There are various conflicting, and rightfully so, critical questions for the group that disseminates it, as it pertains to the Black community as a whole, and what they do for the Black community. So I think its relationship to the conversation on police brutality, it's furtive and it's necessary, but it's niche. And so that comes out because of the ways in which we have to specify Black trans lives matter and Black disabled lives matter, because people aren't being included. And so that's the conversation for me, is the extent of the movement. Because if you think back to the Black Power movement or the Civil Rights movement, there were a lot of ties in economic empowerment, redressing, education, and policies. And so I wonder if policies is what we should be focusing on, or is it the heart of a man, or the heart of a woman, especially as it pertains to racism. Because my prejudice against disabled people was one of ignorance until I met them. And so could a policy have eradicated that? Possibly. But as well, I think that there's this quality of the movement that isn't being discussed. And it's the authentic engagement of one person to another, or the curiosity from one person to engage with another. And that can't be diminished, because as an artist as well, like, that's what I want. I want someone to be curious from the get-go about who I am and what I want and what I do and what I say. And we just leave ourselves a little bit vulnerable to people smiling in front of your face and then not doing anything behind your back, or not doing anything. Yeah, like they'll walk away and not do anything. I mean, the performative activity of, like, say, Mayor de Blasio or in his administration in New York City is telling of a neoliberal identity that does not support active action in the way of advancing people's lives. And so I think, to a certain extent, the movement is, I love the sentiment. And I agree with it 100%. I think that everyone does. And it's curious that there was a unilateral and uniformed disgust with how George Floyd was killed. And that, I mean, I have not heard of a dissenter to his killing and the way that it was handled. So that gives me a little bit of hope and a little bit of pause about the severity of the actions after. And I guess at the base of me, though, I'm like, if you about revolution, then be about it. And let's not take corporate dollars. Let's not take the paternalism of corporations or even other white people. Like, if you really are about it, then you have to separate yourself from the comforts of the society. And if you're about liberation, liberation is so different from justice, and it's so different from equality, and it's so different from equity. Liberation is the full eradication of differences and of respective powers. So that would actually include your oppressor. And what does that mean? Because you don't just recapitulate the wheel by putting in an old oppressor or a new oppressor and an old wineskin. I remember I was at a talk Toni Morrison was giving, and she said matriarchy isn't the solution to patriarchy. And I love that, because it isn't just about another frame of person entering in. Like, that doesn't guarantee justice. That doesn't guarantee success. And so we do need to go a little deeper than just what's on the visage. And so that's what I hope for the movement. And that's what that's what I'm going to do in my work, is assert these truths and strengthen it from its sides. Because I think the core of it is good. But yeah, we got to strengthen the sides.
Yeah. What you made me think about is, again, similar to our earlier conversation around advocacy and what it looks like for you, and how for each person within the disability community, it's different. So I think everyone might have a different relationship to Black Lives Matter, but there is always action that you can take, no matter what level you're at. So all of that said, though, there's still work to be done. Like you said, I feel hopeful that we have made some progress forward, that I don't think we can turn our back to this, even if it's just a small step and there are still corporate dollars involved. Something has shifted. So I want to segue to ADA 30, which is, now we've had 30 years of our rights protected by law. We still have rampant disability discrimination. We still have problems with intersectionality and even racism within our own community.
Well, you struck me when you said about your Zoom meetings and how you can present as non-disabled, because it really is my experience. Like, my not using assistive devices does erase the legibility of disability. And that's when I find the compounding, intersecting hardships of being Black, being a Black man, and being a disabled Black man. Because people don't understand or don't see, and only see fear in respect to what is his arm doing, what's his lurch, what's it about, what's going on, as a means of self-preservation. And to a certain extent, I'm still upset about it, but I understand it. And I understand that people can be prejudiced. I understand that people can not get it initially. And I think one of the things that I am hopeful about is that ignorance isn't forever, and that personal connection actually is the fastest way to full understanding. And I know that's not prudent, or it also isn't effective in the way of, like, not everyone can have a group of friends that have varied disabilities and then get to understand the needs. I would not be an effective artist doing work and welcoming folks into venues that I perform had I not had disabled friends. And that was key for me as I was entering into a solo career.
I'm curious to hear from your perspective what your dream is for the ADA that hasn't been realized yet.
Mm-hmm. Is it one that the government can give is the question. So the one that the government can give, I think that there does need to be a harsher and more direct consequence to inaccessible spaces. That can no longer be sufficient. One example was New York City's expansion of the subways or the revitalization of them, and that none included a wheelchair, or that some are going to have elevators and some aren't. I think about how cost effective a ramp is, like that there isn't necessarily this cost benefit. It's just like, just do it, and there's another way, there's a creative way to do it. Although in tandem there was a cab program that was fairly successful. Oh, Tiffany, this is really hard for me because as much as I say, okay, if we had more representation, for example, in places of power, but that doesn't only mitigate what happens. There needs to be ownership from both sides, from the non-disabled community and from disabled community. The dream that I want, though, is the expansion from compliance to welcoming. This contradicts exactly what I just said, but punitive action, that we don't just rely on punitive action as a means to progress, but that our sense of welcoming actually is more expansive. And because I experienced life without assisted devices, or even I look at our transportation placards as erasing me as well because I don't use a wheelchair. So even with that, we need to expand our notion of who's in our community. And if we do that effectively by expanding welcoming practices, because we look at ramps, everyone loves a ramp. I mean, no one denies that a ramp can be for them. And that's the curious thing about design and about how access is so fluid. So I think our practices and our policies of welcoming and how we look at it from an individual level or from a moment that isn't, because government has a way of just sending a block of aid and it not being very distinguishable, or the way that it's disseminated isn't met with care. And so I would say, how can the government put people in place that would disseminate this block of aid in ways that also effectively communicate care to the community?
It's a big, heavy question. The ADA just didn't happen overnight. And for those of us who have watched Crit Camp on Netflix, and if you haven't, please do, you see these teenagers meeting at camp, which then paved the foundation for Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which then paved the way for the ADA. I love how you touched on it from a internal and external perspective in what I will call a loving disabled gaze, in terms of how can we within our own community see each other fully. And then to the external world, I don't want to be seen as a liability. I don't want to be seen as litigation. I don't want to be seen as a burden. How can I be seen, in your words, from a welcoming care perspective that really centers disability and humanity? So appreciate your thoughts there. I know it was.
Thank you.
5 years ago, first when we met, also when there was a Disability Pride Parade in New York, but it was also when New York City Mayor de Blasio had declared July Disability Pride Month. I'm curious to hear from you, what does Disability Pride look like for you, and what are you proud of?
I mean, first, the month is curious. I would love more history. I would love this month to be about us finding the people who have been erased from history books, from even our anecdotal understandings. There's so many folks who haven't, if I just go into the arts, have not had long careers, but they had really paved some fantastic ways for me, and I don't know their names. So Pride Month for me is actually history and is theory. I need to be very versed in that. But what I'm proud of and who I'm proud of are my contemporaries, my goodness, and my betters. So working with Alice Shepard, who's a dancer choreographer, has been an illuminating and energizing experience. Her passion and vision for disability community and communing has been really exacting. Then there's Ezra Bennis, who's a visual studio artist. There's Shannon Finnegan. Actually, I'm a part of a cohort, an extended residency of folks who are just amazing workers and artists. Madison Zalapani, Kevin Kies Bonilla. Oh my goodness. So many folks. And then it's the other dance artists. It's Mark Travis Rivera. It's Dan Daw. It's Yo-Yo Lin. It's so many folks who are in, and also musicians, Molly Joyce and Jerome Ellis. People who we have, at least in the arts now, I'm saying this, we have someone for every silo, for every genre to talk to us and give us perspective. And I think that's where our power lies. And that's where I know that we can expand and do more when we have real footholds in everything. I haven't even mentioned the tech people and the policy people, but that's, I guess, more so than just them leading the charge. It's like they're creating the containers. And I think that's really important because it's about the containers. It's about who can fit into what you're making. And I'm really proud to know some people who are thinking critically about what it means to be excellent at what you do and how your excellence can actually bubble over to help and to generate other people's activity.
And I'm proud to know you and to see the journey you've been on over the last couple of years of really coming into your own power and your own voice and your own space. So if people want to follow you, where is the best way to do that?
Sure. Oh, and I just have to say, Tiffany, first, thank you so much. That's such a lovely thing to say. I'm like verklempt right now. So I'm at Jerron Herman, JerronHerman across Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And my website is www.jerronherman.com. And I answer my emails.
He does. Yeah. He responded. I said,
Yeah.
Do you want to be on my show?
Well, already know, I'm coming for a Tiffany Yu experience.
For the Tiffany Yu experience. I love it. Well, thank you, Jerron, for being on the show. We'll close it there. And happy ADA 30 and Disability Pride Month.
To you as well, my friend.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Tiffany and You. This is your host, Tiffany Yu. If you enjoyed this conversation, please leave us a rating and write us a review over at Apple Podcasts. It allows these conversations and these episodes to be discovered by other podcast listeners. I'm hoping that we can co-create something here that's valuable for you. So to the extent that you have feedback or other topics you'd like us to explore, don't hesitate to reach out. You can find us at tiffanyyu.com/podcast. And a special shout out to Root Hub for our opening and closing podcast medleys. We release episodes weekly, so I hope that you'll join us next week for the next episode.
Tiffany and you. This one is done and another coming soon. A special rendezvous for Tiffany and you.